quiet village, a prized flower show, and a murder among the blooms. Welcome to Echo Files. I am your host, Walter Finch. Tell me where you're tuning in. I love hearing from you all. Let's begin. The morning air in St. Mildred's was crisp enough to carry the scent of wood smoke from chimneys and the faint perfume of damp autumn leaves. The village, nestled among gentle hills and winding lanes, had the sort of sleepy charm that appeared untouched by time. Everyone knew everyone, or at least claimed to, and news here traveled faster than the railway to London. This morning, the news was about the frosted greenhouse. Not yet about murder, oh no, but about the preparations for the annual chrysanthemum exhibition, which would be held there that very afternoon. The frosted greenhouse, owned by the late Colonel Whitcomb's widow, was a splendid glass structure at the edge of the Whitcomb estate, so called because its etched panes caught the light in patterns like winter frost. Inside, rows of blooms were arranged with military precision. Fiery reds, butter yellows, soft creams, and exotic purples. Each one tended to with almost reverent care by the village's most competitive gardeners. Mrs. Whitcomb had opened the place to the Horticultural Society after her husband's passing. And in her mind, nothing less than perfection was acceptable. By 10 o'clock, ladies in their Sunday best and gentlemen in tweeds were already arriving, tea cakes and gossip in equal supply. Mrs. Partridge, plump and cheerful with a tendency to speak too loudly, was telling anyone who'd listen that she was certain Mrs. Lockwood's chrysanthemums were helped along with something not entirely natural. Reverend Chiswell, who'd been drafted as one of the judges, listened politely while keeping one wary eye on the tea urn, from which Mrs. Cutter was ladling cups with the brisk efficiency of someone who had no intention of letting the milk run out before her turn. Miss Jane Marple, seated unobtrusively near the far corner, sipped her tea with quiet contentment. She was ostensibly there to admire the flowers, though she had an old-fashioned suspicion that competitive gardening tended to bring out the less noble instincts in otherwise respectable people. A single glance at the strained smile between Mrs. Whitcomb and Mr. Arnold Fletcher, the local nurseryman, was enough to confirm that the undercurrents were already at work. The judging commenced just after 11. People clustered in small knots, watching as Reverend Chiswell, Mrs. Craythorne from the next parish, and Mr. George Moffat, who had once grown a dahlia the size of a small child, inspected each entry. There were murmurs of approval, sharp intakes of breath at certain surprising entries, and the occasional hissed accusation of favoritism from behind gloved hands. It was during this quiet bustle that the first note of discord rang out. Not loudly, just a startled cry from the back of the greenhouse. Several heads turned, curious, but the sound was quickly swallowed by the hum of conversation. Only Miss Marple's pale blue eyes lingered a moment on the far corner where the noise had come from, before she resumed her calm inspection of a particularly delicate pink bloom. The prize announcements were delayed. Something about a missing ribbon, it was said, and the villagers took the opportunity to help themselves to more tea and seed cake. Then came a sudden commotion. Mrs. Whitcomb herself, pale and trembling, appeared at the front, clutching the frame of the door for support. Her voice wavered as she spoke. Oh dear God, there's been an accident in the potting shed. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, as though drawn by the same morbid impulse, the crowd began to drift toward the small wooden outbuilding at the far end of the greenhouse. The air outside was cooler, and a fine mist had begun to settle over the grounds. Miss Marple, moving neither too fast nor too slow, kept to the edges of the group. Inside the shed, the earthy smell of compost hung heavy in the air. tools lay neatly on their hooks, a watering can stood half full by the door. And on the floor, sprawled face down among scattered pots and spilled soil, was the body of Arnold Fletcher. The back of his head was darkened with blood. Someone gasped. Someone else whispered, "Murder," though no one yet knew for certain. Miss Marple stood very still, her eyes passing over the scene with quiet attentiveness. She noted the tipped-over stool, the faint marks in the soil near the door, the curious absence of the small pruning shears Fletcher had always carried in his apron pocket. It was all very tragic, of course. And yet, in the stillness between murmurs and questions, Miss Marple's mind began to tick in its gentle, inexorable way. For she knew that, without quite knowing how, that this was no accident at all. For a moment the potting shed held its breath, as if the wood itself were reluctant to admit the thing that had happened within. Then movement returned in little, jerky motions, Mrs. Partridge lifting her hand to her mouth and then thinking better of it. Reverend Chiswell clearing his throat and not quite producing a prayer. Mrs. Cutter whispering, "Fetch the doctor," with the proprietary briskness of a woman who never wasted either tea or time. The door stood half on its hinges, the latch scored as though by a hurried hand. A trickle of damp soil ran from the upturned pots and flattened itself into a smear where someone had stepped and slid. Mrs. Whitcomb's face had a curious waxen stillness. She pressed her gloved fingers together, then released them. And in the small gap, Miss Marple saw a dark crescent where the soft kid had picked up Pete. There was a tremor in the widow's voice that did not quite match the composure of her posture. She said the words one always says, "So dreadful, such a shock, he was only here a moment ago." And Miss Marple, who had heard those words in many rooms, allowed them to pass over her without interruption. She set her teacup quietly on an empty shelf, as though returning it to its proper place were a small courtesy to order that ought not to be neglected even now. Dr. Kendall arrived almost indecently quickly. His surgery abutted the ironmonger's and the church lich gate, and knelt by the body with the professional gloom of a country doctor very experienced at certificates. He touched the cool skin, observed the clotting at the wound, and gave a minute nod that meant later, but not much later. "Best we have the police," he said. And Mrs. Cutter was already halfway to the telephone in the greenhouse office, her apron strings flying like pennants in a stiff breeze. While they waited, the crowd reorganized itself with that instinctive choreography of small communities suddenly gathered around tragedy. Those who were apt to give orders gave them. Those who sought comfort said soft, busy things and handed cups as if warmth in the hand could contradict cold on the floor. The judges were shepherded back towards the chrysanthemums with a murmured assurance that nothing at all, would be touched until the authorities had seen it. This last was not entirely true. Miss Marple watched, without appearing to, as Mrs. Lockwood's palm brushed a shelf and left a neat space where, a moment before, a coil of green raffia had lain. It was a light, automatic tidying gesture, and the coil remained where it was. But the impulse told Miss Marple at least as much as the action might have. Arnold Fletcher lay askew, one leg slightly bent as though in reflex towards rising. The back of his head, beneath graying hair, was dark and matted. He had been a man given to rounds, of the greenhouses, of the gardens, of the village itself, moving in patient circuits that made him indispensable to 100 little growings and bloomings. He had also been a man of opinions. That, too, had its growths and blights in a place like St. Mildred's. "I saw him not half an hour ago," Mrs. Partridge ventured, the words pressing against one another. "He came past my lemon balm, such a scent it has this time of year, and he said the prize ribbon had gone missing. Fancy that. As if anyone would. Well, I suppose it's the sort of prank boys might do, but not murder. The ribbon, Miss Marple said, almost to herself, as if tasting the word. She let her gaze travel to the pegboard. A small hook bore an imprint where something had hung, the dust faintly brighter around it. A ribbon could be any color. It could be blue, perhaps, or crimson. The color did not matter. The absence did. Constable Prowse, who had the aspect of a conscientious grocer temporarily in uniform, arrived at last, puffing and earnest, and with him, a few minutes behind in a car whose fenders seemed perpetually discontented, Inspector Graves from the market town. Graves was the sort of man who always looked as if he had been about to sit down to supper when bad news came. He carried with him the hungry impatience of a thwarted meal. He took in the shed at a glance, then at 2 glances more, and then briskly commenced to put people in places. Witnesses there, judges here, no one in the shed except the doctor, the constable, and himself. Miss Marple, being neither loud nor in the way, found herself unobtrusively allowed to remain where she was. "Name?" Graves asked. Mrs. Whitcomb gave it, with such careful enunciation that it sounded like a recital. "You found him?" "I did not," she said. "I was told. By Mr. Moffat, I think. Or, no, I believe Mrs. Craythorne called out. There was a cry, wasn't there?" She searched the room as if the cry might be hiding under a bench. "There was," Miss Marple said gently. "Earlier, from the back of the greenhouse. Not quite the same thing as this, I think." She looked at the inspector with mild apology, as if to say she hoped she was not making trouble with her distinction. Someone startled by something small, perhaps. A broken pot, or a person where they were not expected. "Thank you, madam," Graves said, polite but indifferent to Smalls. He was tracing with his eyes the scuff in the soil near the door, the faint crescent where a heel had slipped. The mark was not large. One could make out the impression of a heel tip with a little metal sounder in it. Some shoes had them and clicked on stone, some did not. He turned to Constable Prowse. "Keep them where they are, no one in or out of the shed." The first questions, as first questions do, gathered themselves in neat rows. Where was Mr. Fletcher last seen alive? "At the potting bench," said Mrs. Cutter, "fetching twine for the stakes," though on being asked whose stakes, she had to think, and then defensively decided they must have been Mr. Fletcher's own. Had anyone quarreled with him that morning? Mrs. Partridge remembered, everyone remembered, an exchange near the south bed in which Mrs. Lockwood had told Fletcher, with tight politeness, that she did not appreciate insinuations about her supplements. "Harmless kelp," she said emphatically, "and a little bone meal, like any sensible person." Mr. Fletcher had responded with something about rules and fairness, and that those who could not grow without trickery perhaps ought not to grow at all. "I never," Mrs. Lockwood said, and then admitted she had, but that it had been nothing. And besides, everyone quarreled with Arnold sometimes. He made it his business to run other people's. Her hat sat at an unforgiving angle. She had a smudge of green on her thumb, a stain that a person who had been handling stems might reasonably acquire. When Miss Marple's eyes passed over it, Mrs. Lockwood rubbed her thumb with a handkerchief a second longer than strictly necessary. There were other histories, older than this morning's. A new contract the estate had been negotiating with Mr. Fletcher for the winter forcing, which would have meant profit for some and the closing of a door for others. A rumor of seeds ordered under one name and invoiced under another. A village boy, Tom Redding, who had worked a season at Fletcher's and left with bad grace and a scar on his pride, where a public dressing down had caught the bone. Tom stood at the edge of the greenhouse now, his fists in his pockets, ostentatiously watching the clouds as if the chrysanthemums were beneath his notice. Someone said they had seen him earlier near the sheds. Someone else said that was nonsense. Tom said nothing at all. Reticence is often louder than gossip. Miss Marple, who had parochial experience in both, watched the silences as carefully as the speech. Lionel Whitcomb, a pale young man with a beautiful tie and a nose that made most expressions look like disdain, appeared belatedly, claiming to have been at the solicitor's. He expressed the appropriate dismay and then patched it with impatience, as if the day must be got on with and tragedy properly scheduled. There was oil along the inside of his cuff that the damp air had darkened to a stripe. His bicycle leaned against the brick, the chain glistening. When his mother's hand strayed towards him, he flinched almost imperceptibly and then made too much of patting it. "Inspector," Miss Marple said, when Graves had a breath between questions. "Perhaps it is not my place, but I think Mr. Fletcher had been interrupted rather than surprised. If you see," she gestured mild towards the bench, "the twine's end is cut very cleanly. In haste, yes, but cut. One might tear it if one had no shears to hand. Mr. Fletcher would not. He had his little ones always with him. He had them in his apron pocket. I wonder where they are." Graves' mouth thinned. He had already wondered, and wondered too, about the stool by the bench turned to the angle it was, as if a person had stood upon it to reach something higher than they were used to reaching, and then had stepped down again, awkwardly, at a sound or a shadow. He was not unobservant, and he did not subscribe to the superstition that old ladies did not see. "We haven't found them," he said. "We'll look." "Of course," Miss Marple said, as if that were merely a comfort to herself. She folded her hands, the picture of someone content to be reassured. Reverend Chiswell, who had been brought to the greenhouse to judge blossoms and found himself arbitrating fear instead, ventured a word about prayer and propriety. It settled on the air like a gauze veil. People adjusted themselves within it, some sincerely, some because they did not know what else to do. The inspector took details, made lists, and set prowls to guard the shed door as if mischief might creep back and add itself to the crime if not watched. It was a little after noon when the doctor, having done what was proper and no more, stood and dusted his knees. "Blow to the head," he said. "Something narrow, heavy enough. Time, an hour, perhaps a trifle less. You'll have the rest from the post." He did not look at the body when he left. Doctors in villages learn not to look, lest they carry faces home to supper. The greenhouse resumed a version of order in the way of people determined to prove that tragedy could not wholly disarrange civic duty. There was talk, how could there not be, about whether the exhibition could possibly go on and whether, if it could, that would be callous or courageous. Mrs. Whitcomb, in a tone so even it might have been ironed, said the judging would be postponed until tomorrow and that she would speak to the society and to the Gazette. It was said in the voice of a woman whose life must be resumed along correct lines, because collapse would be too intimate and too public a thing to contemplate. Miss Marple drifted, as inconspicuously as a small boat in a slow current, from bench to bench. She put out a finger once to straighten a label, and in doing so noted that a second label, Mrs. Lockwood's, had been re-inked over an older name. The ghost of the former scrawl showed through if one tilted one's head and looked as though one were admiring the petals. At another bench, at the back, a set of boot marks cut through a spilled fan of grit. 2 pairs, she thought, though one was overlain by many subsequent scufflings. The second had a shallow nick in the outer heel, there and there again. Not uncommon in a village where cobblers worked with what they had, but distinctive enough if one were in the habit of noticing such things as where Mr. Moffat's right boot always clacked against the aisle. Mrs. Cutter came up behind her with the teapot and managed, in the act of pouring, to convey a helpful stream of news. That the inspector had found a smear on the shed latch. That Tom Redding had been seen loitering near the tool store yesterday. That Mrs. Lockwood's entry had appeared overnight as if from nowhere, and was very fine indeed, suspiciously fine. And that Mr. Fletcher had said last week that he could smell a cheat in the air, which was the sort of thing men said when they wanted to be asked what they meant. Miss Marple accepted the tea and allowed it to warm her hands. She did not ask what he had meant. People volunteered that, once they'd finished telling the part they liked best. When the inspector at last sought her out, it was with a mixture of courtesy and purpose. "Madam," he said, and the word had no diminishment in it. "You've eyes." "Only the usual number," Miss Marple said mildly. "I think your village will decide for me if I do not ask you what you have seen." "One does not really see, Inspector," she said, her voice reflective as if she were discussing seed catalogs. "One remembers. People are so very much the same, you know, whether they are buying tea or telling lies. I think Mr. Fletcher knew a thing of some importance and made himself unpleasant about it. I think someone who is not used to violence picked up the nearest thing to hand that suited them better than their courage. And I think that person needed the shears afterwards because there is a piece missing from something they didn't wish to be credited for altering. A label, perhaps, or a ribbon." "The ribbon," Graves said, carefully even. "If it had been taken as a prank," Miss Marple said, "it would have been produced, with giggles, to see us scold and forgive. When grown people conceal trifles, they are not trifles." He studied her for a moment, as if a map he had been given lacked a river, and he had just found where it must run. "And suspects?" "Why, everyone, dear Inspector," Miss Marple said, as if this were the most comforting thing in the world. "Everyone who needed their blossoms to be better than they are. Everyone who could not afford Mr. Fletcher's honesty. Everyone for whom a little thing being in the wrong place would be, how shall I put it, distressing to the point of desperation." Her gaze, soft and unfocused as sunlight through glass, came to rest nowhere in particular. But if one had followed it for a moment, one might have found it crossing Mrs. Lockwood's careful hands, Tom Redding's stiff shoulders, Lionel Whitcomb's oiled cuff, and the silent, uncompromising curve of Mr. Moffat's boot heel. Somewhere among these, and perhaps beyond them, a person was beginning to understand that murder had changed the arithmetic of their lives, and that Miss Marple, who looked like no more than a comfortable old lady admiring chrysanthemums, was watching the sums be done. The village, for all its polite facades and church bell rhythms, had an instinct for crisis that ran like a secret brook beneath the hedgerows. By the time the police car had driven away with Mr. Fletcher's body, and Inspector Graves had set himself up in the small reading room at the Whitcomb estate, the lanes were already alive with movement. People who had no errands suddenly found they must pass by the estate gates. Housemaids lingered at the pump to draw more water than any reasonable tea service could require, and curtains were pulled back just far enough for their occupants to be invisible and yet fully informed. Miss Marple, returning to her cottage with a small paper bag of sugar lumps, her only ostensible purchase from the village shop, noticed the signs. Mrs. Harbottle, who never emerged before noon, was leaning against her garden fence, ostensibly shaking crumbs from a cloth. Mr. Simpkins, the postman, who had already finished his round, was loitering at the corner as though waiting for a letter that might arrive of its own accord. Each wore the same expression, a blend of concern, curiosity, and the subtle calculation of how this event would ripple through the quiet patterns of St. Mildred's. The frosted greenhouse itself had been locked, a constable stationed at the side door, though the chrysanthemums inside were in no danger of theft. The bloom's value lay in pride, not currency. The potting shed, with its litter of overturned pots and the lingering scent of soil and blood, was now sealed off entirely. Miss Marple, who had no taste for scenes of violence, had nevertheless stayed long enough to fix the arrangement in her mind, not only the objects, but the absences. That missing ribbon, those missing shears, the twine cut neatly rather than torn. All small things, but small things in St. Mildred's had a way of mattering. By late afternoon, Inspector Graves had begun calling people to the reading room, one by one. Miss Marple was not among the first summoned, which was no surprise to her. The police preferred to start with those who had quarreled openly, been seen in compromising positions, or possessed the sort of temper that could be easily imagined as murderous. Mrs. Lockwood went in first, her hat brim quivering like a held breath. Tom Redding followed, sullen in his workman's jacket. Then Mr. Moffat, whose gait was slow, but whose eyes darted as he passed the constable. Miss Marple took tea with Mrs. Partridge while they waited. And the conversation, though outwardly about the weather and a neighbor's rheumatism, wandered inevitably back to the greenhouse. Mrs. Partridge, with the air of one imparting an entirely harmless piece of information, remarked that she had once overheard Mr. Fletcher telling Mrs. Whitcomb that the prize must go to the best, and the best must be honestly won. That does sound like him, Miss Marple agreed mildly, adding a lump of sugar to her cup. Such sentiments are unassailable until, of course, one considers that honesty is a matter of interpretation. Mrs. Partridge, pleased to have her view dignified, leaned forward. I wouldn't be surprised if that missing ribbon had something to do with it. My sister's boy, he's in Birmingham, told me once about a show there where someone switched the ribbons before the judges had made their rounds to trick them into thinking a certain bloom had already been marked down for a prize. Miss Marple stirred her tea. That would be a foolish game in a village such as ours. People here know exactly what belongs to whom. It was nearly 5 o'clock when the constable tapped on Mrs. Partridge's parlor door to say that the inspector would like a word with Miss Marple. The reading room smelled faintly of beeswax and old paper. Graves was seated behind a sturdy oak table, a notebook open before him, his pencil poised. He looked up, and for the first time that day, Miss Marple thought she saw a hint of fatigue behind his professional steadiness. Miss Marple, he began, you've seen more of this village than most, and I suspect you've noticed more than you'd admit outright. You said earlier you thought Mr. Fletcher had been interrupted. Can you tell me why? She settled herself into the chair opposite, folding her hands. It was the twine, Inspector. A man like Mr. Fletcher would not leave a cut end lying about unless he meant to return to it immediately. And if he were called away in haste, why, he would have tucked his shears into his apron pocket, as was his habit. But they are not there. That tells me that whoever interrupted him either took them at once or that Mr. Fletcher handed them over before there was any quarrel. The former suggests intent. The latter, familiarity. Graves wrote a note, his pencil moving briskly. Familiarity. Someone he knew well enough to give his tools to? Precisely, Miss Marple said. One does not hand over one's shears to just anyone. They're rather personal things, fitted to the hand. It's like lending a pair of spectacles. One only does so to someone trusted. The inspector regarded her thoughtfully. We've had 3 mentions of quarrels with him this week. Mrs. Lockwood over her supplements, Tom Redding over unpaid wages. He claims Fletcher promised extra for work done during last year's exhibition. And Lionel Whitcomb over a business arrangement concerning winter forcing. All three could have been in or near the shed today. Tom Redding, Miss Marple said softly, would not be welcomed into the greenhouse without reason. Mr. Fletcher was a stickler for rules. If Tom was there, it was either by invitation or by stealth. As for Mrs. Lockwood, I should be surprised if she could lift anything heavy enough to cause that injury without both hands. And if she had both hands occupied, she could not have taken the shears in the same moment. Lionel, on the other hand, is strong enough, and, if you'll forgive me, his mother's greenhouse is a place where he would move about unquestioned. Graves leaned back in his chair. And Mr. Moffat? Miss Marple gave a small smile. Mr. Moffat is careful. Too careful, perhaps. His boots carry a distinctive mark on the heel, one I saw at the back bench where some blooms had been shifted about. He would not have left such a trace unless he thought no one would notice. And yet, she tilted her head, as though weighing the thought. It is possible, Inspector, that more than one person visited the shed in that narrow window of time. A quarrel begun by one, finished by another. We mustn't assume the killer and the last person seen with the victim are the same. The inspector's pencil stilled. That complicates things. Yes, Miss Marple said, rising. Murder usually does. When she stepped out into the cooling evening, the mist from earlier had thickened into a fine drizzle, turning the cobbles slick. She took the long way home, passing by the rear of the Whitcomb estate where a narrow path led to the gardener's cottages. One of the smaller sheds stood with its door ajar, light spilling faintly from within. Through the gap, she saw Lionel Whitcomb leaning over a bench, his coat sleeve drawn back as he worked at something with quick, nervous hands. He glanced over his shoulder, then closed the door sharply. Miss Marple did not pause. She continued past as though her route had been chosen without thought. But in her mind, the image of Lionel in the shed settled into place alongside the missing shears and the cut twine. At her own gate, she paused to retrieve the evening paper, left there by the obliging young boy from the shop. The headline, of course, made much of the greenhouse tragedy, and beneath it was a single line. Police appeal for any information regarding missing gardening tools believed to be connected to the incident. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Inspector Graves had decided to see who might react to such a notice. That was promising. Inside, she set the kettle on the hob and lit the lamp. As the water began to murmur, she considered the day's events. Fletcher's death had not been a sudden whim. The weapon, whatever it was, had been at hand in the shed. But the opportunity, that short span of minutes when the judges were distracted and the ribbon was missing, had been narrow indeed. That argued planning. And planning, in a place like St. Mildred's, was often betrayed by something small and habitual. A pattern of movement, a preference in tools, a glance at the wrong time. She poured her tea and sat by the window, looking out into the soft dark. Somewhere in the village, someone was thinking very hard about what they had done. Perhaps convincing themselves that no one had seen, that the matter would fade into gossip and be forgotten. Miss Marple, who knew just how long gossip could last, especially when it was attached to something as unforgivable as murder, doubted very much they would sleep soundly. The next day, she decided, would require a visit or two. Not to the most obvious suspects, for they would be on their guard, but to those who knew them well enough to speak freely. In St. Mildred's, truth often arrived sideways, in the form of an idle remark or a complaint about something entirely unrelated. And Miss Marple, with her gentle smile and her seemingly aimless questions, had a way of finding those remarks and complaints like a gardener uncovering bulbs beneath the soil, knowing exactly which would bloom into the truth. That night, as the rain whispered against the glass, the village settled into uneasy quiet. The frosted greenhouse stood locked and still, its etched panes dim in the moonlight. Inside, the chrysanthemums waited, their perfect blooms oblivious to the fact that among them lay the seeds of a much darker story. One that Miss Marple intended, with patience and precision, to bring fully into the light. Morning came with a pale wash of sunlight that filtered through the low clouds, giving St. Mildred's the look of a village still half asleep. The rain had rinsed the air clean, and the hedgerows dripped steadily into the ruts, along the lanes. For all that freshness, there was a tension in the air. Not the wholesome expectancy of a fine day, but the held breath of a place waiting to hear what would happen next. The frosted greenhouse remained locked, the chrysanthemums visible only through the misted glass. Constable Prowse stood guard again, looking faintly miserable in his mackintosh, shifting from one foot to the other as though keeping time with his own thoughts. Miss Marple, basket in hand, passed by on her way to the vicarage and paused to exchange a few polite words about the weather. Prowse, flattered by her attention, volunteered that the inspector had gone into the market town early to follow up on something. Though what that something was, he could not say. She left him with a nod and continued toward the vicarage. The Reverend Chiswell was in his study, the fire barely coaxed to life, a sheaf of hymn sheets on his desk. He welcomed her with genuine warmth and a faint air of relief, as though her presence somehow promised a steadier morning. The conversation began with parish matters. A jumble sale in aid of the church roof, a dispute over the allotments. But soon circled, as everything in the village did, back to Mr. Fletcher. "You see, Miss Marple," the Reverend said, stirring his tea, "Arnold was not a man one could easily persuade. He had his own idea of right and wrong, and no amount of soft talk could shift him. That is an admirable quality in a judge of flowers," Miss Marple replied mildly, "but less so, perhaps, if his judgment touched on a person's livelihood." He hesitated, then nodded. There was talk, only talk, mind you, that Arnold meant to submit a formal complaint to the Horticultural Society about the supplements Mrs. Lockwood uses, and Lionel Whitcomb's winter-forcing scheme. Arnold was convinced it would damage the soil in the long term. He might have been right, but he would not have said it gently. "Truth is rarely gentle," Miss Marple murmured, setting down her cup. "And people are rarely grateful for it, even when they ought to be." When she left the vicarage, she took the path that led past the row of cottages belonging to estate workers. At the third, she found Mrs. Sims, the gardener's wife, kneeling over a tub of washing. A sturdy, practical woman with a knack for knowing everyone's business, Mrs. Sims greeted Miss Marple cheerfully and asked if she'd heard the latest. "It's said," she began, lowering her voice despite there being no one else in sight, "that Mr. Moffat's prize blooms weren't his at all. Brought in from a nursery near Lewis, so they say. And Fletcher, well, he'd have known. Can't keep anything like that from him." "Imported blooms," Miss Marple said, as though musing over a recipe. "That would be rather frowned upon, I imagine." Mrs. Sims sniffed. "More than frowned on, it's cheating, and Moffat's not the sort to lose." Gracefully, Miss Marple thanked her and continued on her way, filing the remark alongside a dozen other scraps of village knowledge she had gathered since yesterday. Each was like a fragment of a larger pattern, though the edges did not yet fit together. By midday, Inspector Graves was back, his coat damp and his mood no more cheerful for the excursion. Miss Marple happened to encounter him at the post office, where he was speaking in low tones to the postmistress. His glance flickered toward her, and after a moment's hesitation, he said, "Miss Marple, if you've a moment, walk with me." They went along the lane in companionable silence until he said, "I've confirmed that Fletcher telephoned the society office in the market town 2 days ago. He told them he had proof of a rules violation and would present it at the exhibition. He wouldn't say who. That would give the person in question a very short window in which to act," Miss Marple observed. "Long enough, perhaps, to plan an interruption. Short enough to feel desperate." Graves nodded grimly. "And there's something else, the missing shears. They weren't found in the shed, and they weren't among Fletcher's effects. But a set of pruning shears turned up this morning in the ditch near the main road. Blood on them, though the rains washed most of it away." Miss Marple considered this. A ditch is a curious place to discard such a thing. Not hidden exactly, just thrown away in haste. That suggests the person was either interrupted or became suddenly afraid they'd be seen carrying them. If the road is near the estate boundary, someone leaving on foot or bicycle might have tossed them aside rather than risk being stopped. The inspector gave her a sharp look. Lionel Whitcomb was seen cycling toward the village around that time. Claims he was going to the solicitor, but the clerk says he didn't arrive until half an hour later than he should have. "That is interesting," Miss Marple said, without committing herself further. "But it is best to remember that people in villages sometimes lie about small things for reasons that have nothing to do with murder. A visit to the solicitor might have been preceded by something Lionel considered too trivial or too compromising to admit." Graves sighed. "You make it sound as if everyone here could be hiding something." "Oh, but they could," Miss Marple said with quiet certainty. That afternoon, the village had its first real taste of speculation, unrestrained by the presence of the police. At the tea shop, Mrs. Partridge held forth on the theory that Fletcher had been killed for love rather than rivalry, though she was vague on whose love was involved, while Mrs. Cutter insisted it was all about money and contracts. Young Tom Redding was spotted near the smithy, his hands thrust deep in his pockets, and the sight alone was enough to send a whisper running that he'd been in trouble before, and this was the sort of thing one did not grow out of. Miss Marple, moving quietly from one group to another, heard each theory and stored it away. She did not correct anyone. People often revealed more in the act of speculation than they did under direct questioning. As the day drew toward evening, she took a deliberate detour past the Whitcomb estate. Through a gap in the hedge, she saw Lionel speaking with Mrs. Lockwood. It was not a friendly conversation. Mrs. Lockwood's hands were on her hips, and Lionel's face was set in a scowl. She caught only a few words. "Could have warned me," and "too late now." Before they moved apart, Lionel striding toward the house, Mrs. Lockwood toward the lane. Miss Marple made no sign that she had seen them. She simply noted that whatever bound those two together at this moment was unlikely to be public knowledge. That night, as she sat knitting by the fire, her thoughts returned again and again to the ribbon. It was such a small thing. Yet it had vanished at precisely the moment when Fletcher must have been most alert to the entries in the exhibition. If it had been taken to hide something, an alteration to a plant's display, perhaps, that would have required speed and privacy. The potting shed, with its tools and supplies, would have been the logical place to make such a change. Fletcher, finding someone there, might have objected, firmly enough to provoke panic. But there was still the earlier cry from the back of the greenhouse, the one that had nothing directly to do with the murder. That moment, Miss Marple felt sure, was when the ribbon had been taken. And whoever had taken it might not have been the one who struck Fletcher down. She laid her knitting aside and made a small note in her diary for the morning. Visit Mrs. Lockwood. Ask about re-inking labels. Then another. Speak to Mr. Moffat about imported blooms. There was no hurry. In St. Mildred's, a truth uncovered too quickly had a way of vanishing again before it could be properly held. Better to let it grow in the mind of the guilty party like a seed under glass until the warmth of their own fear coaxed it into bloom. And when it did, Miss Marple intended to be there, smiling politely to admire it. The following morning dawned brighter, though the air still carried the faint tang of yesterday's rain. The lanes were mottled with puddles that reflected the sky in sharp fragments, and the hedgerows bowed under the weight of lingering droplets. St. Mildred's seemed outwardly restored to its ordinary rhythm. Post being delivered, milk bottles clinking on doorsteps. But beneath the calm surface, there was a tautness, like the skin of a drum. The murder had not yet faded into the category of village misfortune to be shaken over at tea. It was still fresh enough to make people glance over their shoulders. Miss Marple left her cottage with a small wicker basket and the appearance of a woman bent on some errand to the grocer. In truth, her destination was Mrs. Lockwood's neat stone house on the edge of the green. A narrow front garden lay before it, all perfectly clipped box hedges and an arch of climbing roses trained with near military discipline. Mrs. Lockwood answered the door herself. She was wearing a well-fitted dress in sober gray, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. If her composure was less than perfect, it was betrayed only by the faintest quickness in her eyes. "Miss Marple," she said with just the right touch of formality. "I hardly expected visitors so early." "I hope I haven't disturbed you, my dear," Miss Marple said, her smile mild as the sun peeping through clouds. "I thought I might call to ask your advice on labeling seedlings. You have such a clear, steady hand on your exhibition cards, so much better than my own." Mrs. Lockwood's eyes flickered, but she stepped back to allow Miss Marple inside. The front room smelled faintly of polish and lavender, its order immaculate. On a side table near the window stood several small pots, each with a crisp white label neatly inked. "It's all in the pen," Mrs. Lockwood said, moving toward them. "One must have the right nib and keep the ink fresh. I always re-ink before a show, just to be sure nothing looks faded. It gives a better impression." "How sensible," Miss Marple murmured, peering at the labels. "And I suppose if one smudged a card or made a mistake, one could simply replace it? I have done so often enough with my seed packets." Mrs. Lockwood gave a quick smile that did not reach her eyes. "Of course. Though, at an exhibition, the cards are fixed before judging begins. It would be irregular to change one after that." Miss Marple nodded. "And yet, sometimes one must if something has been damaged. Imagine if a ribbon went missing, for example, and one's entry was suddenly unmarked. It could be most distressing." There was a silence, and in that moment Mrs. Lockwood adjusted a pot by a fraction, as if to busy her hands. "I can't imagine how such a thing would happen. The whole business is dreadful. Poor Arnold. He was, well, he could be trying." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed softly. "He had a gift for making himself unwelcome in the wrong places." She straightened, her eyes passing lightly over the ink pot and pen laid neatly on the table. "Well, I shall not keep you, my dear. Thank you for the advice." Outside, the crisp morning air felt almost too fresh after the closed, lavender-scented room. Miss Marple walked slowly toward the high street, her mind turning over the exchange. Mrs. Lockwood had not lied exactly. Her tone lacked the defensive sharpness of the dishonest. but she had sidestepped with care. The way a person skirts a nettle patch, they know by heart. Her next stop was the nursery yard where Mr. Moffat was often to be found among the rows of potted plants. Today he was directing a young lad to stack crates. His manner was brisk, his broad back bent slightly as though the weight of his own seriousness was pressing on him. "Mr. Moffat," Miss Marple greeted, resting her hands lightly on the gate. "I hope I'm not intruding. I had a small question about chrysanthemums, specifically about sourcing unusual varieties." His head came up sharply. "Unusual how?" "Oh, color variations, patterns on the petals, things one might not find in the average village garden. I heard someone mention a nursery near Lewis that had remarkable stock." His expression did not change, but his hand paused on the crate he was shifting. "A person could buy from anywhere if they wanted to," he said slowly. "Not against the law, but against the society rules," Miss Marple said gently. "Though, of course, if one's blooms were damaged, one might be tempted to replace them at the last minute, especially if one's reputation depended on a prize." Mr. Moffat's jaw tightened. "I grow my own, Miss Marple. Always have." She inclined her head as though satisfied, but she noticed how quickly he turned away to bark another instruction at the lad. His reaction had the faint over-quickness of someone anxious to shut a door before anyone could look inside. From the nursery she walked to the green, where Mrs. Partridge was holding court on a bench, the day's gossip spilling as freely as the crumbs from her paper bag of seed cake. Miss Marple sat with her just long enough to learn that Tom Redding had been seen coming from the direction of the estate on the morning of the murder, his boots muddy and his face set. "He said he'd been to the smithy, but I don't think so," Mrs. Partridge declared. "His mother says he left the house before breakfast. What kind of errand takes a lad out so early?" Miss Marple made an approving sound, as though this were a most interesting detail, and then excused herself. The pattern was beginning to take shape. Not clearly enough to name the killer, but enough to show that several people's stories overlapped at the edges, where the truth was usually to be found. She stopped once more before returning home, at the small lane that ran behind the Whitcomb estate. The ditch where the pruning shears had been found lay half hidden by overgrown grass. She crouched, her knees protesting mildly, and examined the damp earth. There were faint impressions of tire tracks here, narrow enough for a bicycle. One mark curved as though a rider had stopped briefly before pushing on toward the main road. That evening, she found herself once more in the company of Inspector Graves, who had come to the vicarage for tea and had been persuaded to walk back part way with her. The lamps were being lit in the cottages, their yellow glow soft against the deepening blue of the sky. "I think," Miss Marple said conversationally, "that your shears will prove to have no fingerprints worth mentioning. Whoever discarded them was careful, or else wore gloves." Graves grunted. "You may be right. But the bicycle tracks near the ditch interest me. Could be Lionel Whitcomb's or anyone else's." "Possibly," Miss Marple agreed. "But I suspect the tracks were made after the shears were dropped. And if that is so, it would mean the killer left another way. One less obvious, one that would not risk being seen near the road." The inspector glanced at her. "You've got something in mind?" "Only that in small places, people often choose the route they've taken 100 times before, without thinking. Habit is a great revealer, Inspector. We need only see where each suspect's habits would have led them after leaving the shed." Graves was silent a moment, then said, "And you think you can work that out?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, I think the village will tell me," without realizing they're doing so. As they parted at her gate, The old lady stood for a moment in the cool night air, her gaze resting on the dim outline of the Whitcomb estate beyond the hedgerows. The greenhouse was dark, its frosted panes reflecting only the faintest hint of starlight. Somewhere inside those walls lay the final link between a vanished ribbon, a set of missing shears, and the sudden, violent death of Arnold Fletcher. Miss Marple intended to find it before another night passed. The following day broke with a pale, watery sun, casting long, thin shadows across the cobbled lanes of St. Mildred's. It was market day, and the square was already alive with the sound of vendors arranging their stalls, calling out their wares, and the low rumble of carts arriving from neighboring villages. Ordinarily, Miss Marple might have gone to look over the produce. She had a fondness for the honey from Mr. Latham's hives. But today, her purpose was different. Market day was the perfect occasion to hear what people were saying when they thought they were merely chatting. She took her time, moving from the basket makers to the haberdashery stall, greeting everyone with that gentle courtesy that disarmed suspicion. Here and there she caught fragments of conversation. The greenhouse murder had displaced even the scandal of Mrs. Pritchard's niece running off with a traveling salesman. "Mark my words, it was that young Redding," one man was saying over a pile of turnips. "Hot-headed sort, and Fletcher gave him the sack last year." "Not a bit of it," replied another. "Lockwood's the one with cause. She'd have lost face if he reported her for cheating." Miss Marple didn't linger. She was listening for something subtler, not the obvious accusations, but the slips of the tongue that came when people thought they were stating something harmless. At the baker's stall, she found Mrs. Sims again, paying for a loaf. The woman turned to her eagerly. "Oh, Miss Marple, you've heard about the bicycle, haven't you?" "Bicycle?" Miss Marple repeated, with a mild lift of the eyebrows. "Mr. Prowse told my husband last night. Lionel Whitcomb's was seen leaning against the greenhouse wall that morning. He says Lionel told him he'd come in through the side gate and left it there while he fetched something from the sheds. Didn't say what, mind you. And that was just before Fletcher was found." Miss Marple received this with a thoughtful hum, as though considering the best way to serve a fruitcake. She thanked Mrs. Sims and moved on, her mind returning to the bicycle tracks near the ditch. If Lionel had indeed left his cycle by the greenhouse, those tracks were unlikely to be his. Unless, of course, he had lied about where he left it. She took the road that led past the Whitcomb estate, where the side gate was visible through a screen of beech trees. The ground there was soft enough to take impressions, and indeed she saw the faint outline of a tire near the gatepost. Not fresh, but recent enough to survive the light rains. She knelt to look closer, untroubled by the damp seeping into her skirt. There was something peculiar. The tread was uneven, as though one section of the tire was more worn than the rest. That sort of thing happened when a bicycle had been ridden for years without replacement. Lionel, she knew, had a rather new machine. A faint sound behind her made her straighten. Tom Redding stood a few yards away, hands in his pockets, regarding her with the wary defiance of a youth who expects to be accused. "Morning, Tom," she said pleasantly. "Out early?" "Just passing," he muttered. "Looking for work. Not that there's much." "It must be hard to find steady work in a small place," Miss Marple said. "I expect one takes odd jobs, fetching, carrying, sometimes even for the estate." His eyes flickered, and he shifted his weight. "Used to? Not now. Not since Fletcher." He stopped, as though realizing he'd said too much, and turned as if to go. Miss Marple let him. People often revealed the most when you didn't press them. But she filed away the look in his eyes. It wasn't guilt exactly. It was something closer to fear of being blamed, whether or not he deserved it. By midday, she had made her way to the vicarage garden, where Reverend Chiswell was pruning a row of rose bushes. He greeted her warmly, offering her a seat on a nearby bench. "I suppose," Miss Marple said after a few pleasantries, "that the Society's rules are quite strict about entries." "Very," he said. "All blooms must be grown by the exhibitor. No artificial aids beyond what's permitted. Labels must match the entry forms exactly. It's taken seriously. It has to be, or there'd be no point. And if someone were to swap a label after entry's closed," the Reverend frowned, "that would be quite improper. Grounds for disqualification. And if Fletcher suspected it, well, you know he'd never let it pass." Miss Marple thought of Mrs. Lockwood's re-inked label. If Fletcher had caught her, or anyone, changing one, it might well have led to confrontation. But the confrontation might have been about more than pride. A prize meant prestige, and in a small community, prestige could mean influence, customers, and even income. Her next call was less formal. She went to the small, ivy-covered cottage at the far end of the lane, home to old Mr. Tilling, who had once been a groundskeeper for the estate. He was nearly blind now, but retained an ear for the comings and goings around the place. "They don't think to notice me," he said, when she had asked about the morning of the murder. "But I hear 'em. That morning I heard 2 people pass my gate in quick step. One was young, light tread, the other heavier, about 10 minutes apart." "Both going the same way?" "Aye, towards the greenhouse." He tilted his head. The light tread came back again after a while. "In a hurry, mind you." Miss Marple thanked him, her mind noting the times. If his memory was right, there had been at least 2 separate visits to the greenhouse before Fletcher was found. That might explain why the missing ribbon and the murder felt like connected but distinct events. Later that afternoon, she encountered Inspector Graves outside the post office. His manner was brisk, but there was a glimmer in his eyes that told her he had news. "The shears," he said quietly. "We traced the make. Sold only by a supplier in the next county. Fletcher bought them himself last year. But there's a catch. The tip of one blade has a nick in it. And we found a scrap of crimson silk caught there. Matches the prize ribbons." Miss Marple allowed herself a small nod. "So the shears were used to cut the ribbon, before they were used for something far worse." "That's how it looks." Graves glanced about to ensure they weren't overheard. "We've narrowed it down. Whoever killed Fletcher had already taken that ribbon, or was in the act of taking it, when he found them. He tried to stop them, and they turned the shears on him." "And then discarded them in haste," Miss Marple finished. "It fits." "But which of them was it?" Graves asked. "Lockwood, Moffat, Lionel, Redding?" They all had reason. Miss Marple's eyes softened with their usual mildness. "It will come down to habit, Inspector, and to the way guilt alters a person's smallest actions." That evening, she attended the hastily rescheduled judging at the frosted greenhouse. The chrysanthemums were as perfect as ever, but the air in the glasshouse was different. Heavier, watchful. Each exhibitor hovered near their entry, eager for the verdict. She wandered between the benches, her gaze seemingly absorbed in the blooms, but her attention fixed on the people. Lionel avoided looking at the prize table altogether. Mrs. Lockwood stood too still, her eyes darting whenever someone passed close to her plant. Mr. Moffat kept shifting his weight, his gaze flickering toward the back benches. Tom Redding lurked near the door, as if ready to leave at a moment's notice. And then, as she paused by Mrs. Lockwood's entry, Miss Marple saw it. The faintest tremor in the woman's hand as she adjusted the ribbon now restored to its place. Not the tremor of nerves alone, but the careful handling of someone acutely aware of what that ribbon had once meant in the dark corner of the shed. She said nothing. Not yet. But she knew. And she knew, too, that the moment to draw the threads together was coming very soon. The killer had taken something small, thinking it a trifle. But in St. Mildred's, trifles could be fatal. The morning after the judging, St. Mildred's wore an odd mixture of pride and unease. The ribbons had been awarded. Mrs. Lockwood, in particular, had received hers with a smile that was almost too carefully measured. But the shadow of Fletcher's death lingered over the whole affair. People spoke of the exhibition results in subdued voices, as though it were improper to celebrate openly while the murder went unsolved. Miss Marple, having taken her tea early, decided it was time to prod the truth into revealing itself. She knew from long experience that the guilty were rarely silent for long. Fear had a way of loosening the tongue, not tightening it. Her plan was to call on each of the key figures in turn, but not with direct questions. That sort of bluntness made liars cautious. Instead, she would tempt them into betraying themselves with something so small they would hardly notice they'd done it. Her first call was to the Whitcomb house. Mrs. Whitcomb herself received her in a small morning room overlooking the gardens. She was gracious, but her hands, neatly folded on the table, were paler than usual, and Miss Marple saw the faint imprint where a wedding ring had once been worn, but was now absent. "My dear, I wanted to tell you," Miss Marple said gently, "how very fine the exhibition looked yesterday. I am sure your late husband would have been proud." Mrs. Whitcomb's smile was thin. "It is good to have the tradition continue, even under such trying circumstances. I only wish—" She trailed off, and her gaze slid toward the greenhouse visible through the misted window. "Mr. Fletcher's absence will be felt," Miss Marple said. "He was devoted to the work." Mrs. Whitcomb's mouth tightened. Devoted, yes, but not always diplomatic. I fear he made enemies. Miss Marple let the pause hang, then said in her mildest tone, "And enemies do not always confine themselves to words." The widow looked at her sharply, then lowered her gaze. "You mean well, Miss Marple, but I think this is a matter for the police." She rang for tea, and the conversation drifted to safer topics. Yet in the moment before the maid entered, Miss Marple had seen something flicker across the woman's face, an awareness that perhaps the matter was not as distant from her own family as she wished to believe. From there, Miss Marple took the path toward the nursery, where Mr. Moffat was sorting through a delivery. His manner was gruff, but not unfriendly. She complimented the quality of his blooms, letting the conversation wander to the subject of sourcing. "It must be difficult," she said, "to ensure one always has the right variety ready for the exhibition." "Difficult?" He gave a short laugh. "Not for me. I plan months in advance." "Still," Miss Marple persisted gently, "if something happened to one's prize entry, an accident, say, one might be tempted to find a replacement." His eyes narrowed. "I wouldn't need to, but others might. And perhaps," she said softly, "others might do worse to protect their chances." For a moment he looked ready to snap, but instead he turned abruptly to the crates. "That's not my concern, Miss Marple. I grow my own. Always have, always will." She left him to his work, satisfied that his denial, though emphatic, had been delivered with the defensive speed of a man who had thought about the possibility more than once. Her next visit was to Tom Redding's small lodgings. He answered the door in his shirt sleeves, looking as though he hadn't slept well. "Tom," Miss Marple said kindly, "I wondered if you might help me with something. I've been thinking of putting in a small vegetable bed." and I'd like advice from someone who knows the soil round here." The flattery seemed to disarm him, and he agreed readily enough, though his manner was still guarded. As they talked in the narrow yard behind his lodgings, Miss Marple let her gaze drift to his bicycle leaning against the wall. Its front tire had an uneven tread, worn more in one place than the rest, exactly like the mark she'd seen by the estate gate. "That's a fine machine," she remarked. "Have you had it long?" "3 years," he said. "Got it second-hand." "And it served you well, I expect. One gets into the habit of using the same paths, doesn't one? Easier than trying a new route." He shrugged, but she saw his jaw tighten slightly. Suppose so. When she left him, she knew 2 things. First, the tire marks by the side gate were almost certainly Tom's. Second, he was uneasy about being connected to that spot on the morning of the murder. Whether that unease came from guilt or from fear of being blamed, she could not yet say. In the afternoon, she took tea at Mrs. Partridge's, who had an unerring instinct for the newest whispers. Between slices of seed cake, Mrs. Partridge confided that she had seen Mrs. Lockwood in animated conversation with Lionel Whitcomb behind the greenhouse, not an hour before Fletcher's body was found. "They stopped talking sharpish when they saw me," she said with relish, "like 2 cats caught by the milk jug." Miss Marple smiled at the image. "Did you hear what they were saying?" "Only the tail end. Something about it's too late now and should have told me sooner. But that's enough to set the mind working, isn't it?" It was indeed. Combined with her own observation of the same pair later that day, it confirmed that there was a link between them, and likely to the ribbon and the shears. As evening fell, Miss Marple sat by her fire, knitting steadily. The facts arranged themselves in her mind like pieces of a quilt. The missing ribbon, cut with Fletcher's own shears, the re-inked label, the bicycle tracks, the hurried disposal of the weapon, and, most tellingly, the overlapping stories that placed more than one suspect near the potting shed in that narrow span of time. She suspected now that Fletcher had interrupted someone tampering with an entry, cutting or switching a ribbon to alter the judging. The person had panicked, striking him with the shears. But she also suspected that this person had not acted alone. There was a second layer, a shared interest or mutual protection, that explained why certain people's accounts dovetailed too neatly. The next day would be the time for a gentle test, the sort of thing that Miss Marple excelled at, creating a situation in which the guilty party would be forced, quite without realizing it, to reveal themselves. She would, as she thought of it, simply plant the right seed in the right soil and let it grow. Before bed, she wrote a short note to Inspector Graves, inviting him to tea at her cottage the following afternoon. In it, she promised a small development that may be of interest. It was phrased so mildly that any other reader might have thought it concerned nothing more serious than a lost cat. But Graves, she trusted, would understand. As she set the note aside for posting in the morning, Miss Marple allowed herself a rare moment of satisfaction. The truth was very close now, so close she could almost feel it, like the faint warmth of sunlight behind a cloud. One more day, she thought, and the matter would be ready to bring into the open. And when it was, she would make sure the revelation bloomed with all the inevitability of spring, leaving no room for the guilty to hide among the flowers. The following afternoon arrived with a deceptive serenity. The air was soft and still, and the chrysanthemums in Miss Marple's back garden stood in polite rows as if prepared for inspection. She had spent the morning preparing her small development, which amounted in truth to little more than a few careful remarks to the right people. But in Miss Marple's hands, the right remarks could be as effective as a signed confession. Inspector Graves arrived precisely at 3 o'clock, his boots leaving faint prints on the damp path. He looked curious rather than convinced, the expression of a man humoring an old friend's hunch. Miss Marple ushered him into her parlor, where the tea tray was already set. "I have been thinking, Inspector," she began as she poured. "Our murderer's great mistake was in treating the ribbon and the murder as if they were the same problem. They were not. The ribbon was the cause of the quarrel, yes. But the killing was a moment's panic. And panic leaves a trail that is quite different from planning." Graves leaned forward slightly. "You believe they didn't intend to kill Fletcher?" "I believe," Miss Marple said, "that Fletcher surprised someone in the act of cheating, cutting or switching the ribbon on a prized bloom. That person had Fletcher's shears in hand and used them without thinking. But the disposal of the shears afterward, that was another mind's work, a calmer mind. And that is why we must look for two people working in concert." The inspector frowned. "Two people? That complicates matters." "Yes," Miss Marple said serenely, "but it also explains them. I took the liberty this morning of remarking, quite casually of course, in Mrs. Partridge's hearing that the police were very close to identifying the exact moment the shears left the potting shed. I suggested they had found a new witness who saw the killer carrying them." Graves gave her a sharp glance. "And you expected that to stir someone up?" "My dear Inspector, in a village like St. Mildred's, that remark will be halfway round the lanes by tea time. By tomorrow morning, one of our guilty parties will be trying to confirm or contradict it with their partner in crime. That, I think, will be your moment." She sipped her tea, perfectly composed, while Graves studied her as if weighing the sense of it. "And if no one takes the bait?" he asked. "Then I shall try again, with a different seed. But I don't think it will be necessary." They spoke a little longer, reviewing the details, the tire marks at the side gate, the re-inked label, the conflicting accounts of Lionel Whitcomb's movements. Graves left looking thoughtful, and Miss Marple returned to her knitting, though her eyes strayed now and again to the lane outside. She had planted her seed. Now she would wait for it to sprout. By evening, word had indeed reached the tea shop that the police had a new witness. Mrs. Cutter was overheard telling a customer that it was only a matter of hours now, and Mrs. Lockwood was seen leaving the shop with a face set tight as a drum. Lionel Whitcomb, too, was observed crossing the green with unusual haste, his eyes scanning the street as though measuring how many ears might be listening. Miss Marple, who had taken a table in the far corner of the tea shop, stirred her tea very slowly and made no comment. She did not need to. The looks that passed between certain people were enough to tell her that the little rumor had done its work. The next morning, she rose early and walked to the Whitcomb estate, under the pretense of delivering a jar of quince jelly to Mrs. Whitcomb. She took the path behind the greenhouse, where the frost still lingered in shaded corners. As she approached the potting shed, she caught sight of two figures, Lionel and Mrs. Lockwood, standing close together near the side gate. Their voices were low, but the still air carried fragments of the exchange. "Said they saw someone," Lionel was saying, his tone sharp. "We need to be sure." "It's too late for that," Mrs. Lockwood hissed back. "You should never have—" She broke off suddenly, glancing over her shoulder. Miss Marple, apparently absorbed in adjusting the lid of her jelly jar, gave them the gentlest of smiles and walked on. That afternoon she invited both of them, along with Mr. Moffat and Tom Redding, to tea at her cottage, ostensibly to discuss a proposed charity sale for the church roof fund. It It was a transparent excuse. But one of Miss Marple's advantages was that people rarely suspected her of anything beyond mild interference. They arrived with varying degrees of reluctance. Mrs. Lockwood tight-lipped, Lionel with a faint air of condescension, Moffat gruff, and Tom Redding fidgeting with his cap. Inspector Graves, at Miss Marple's request, happened to drop in midway through to collect a subscription list. Miss Marple served tea, making small talk about the exhibition, the weather, and the best way to store bulbs over winter. Then, with the same tone one might use to discuss the price of sugar, she said, "It's the oddest thing. Inspector Graves tells me they found that the shears were used twice that morning, once to cut the ribbon and then again later, for something far more dreadful. 2 sets of fingerprints," he says. Graves, catching her glance, nodded gravely. "We can tell they were handled by 2 different people within a short space of time." The effect was immediate. Lionel's teacup rattled in its saucer. Mrs. Lockwood's fingers tightened around her napkin until it tore. Moffat stared fixedly at his plate. Tom Redding looked from one face to another, as if seeing something for the first time. Miss Marple went on blithely. "Of course, that does make one wonder. The person who cut the ribbon might not be the same as the one who... Well, and if they weren't, then one of them is protecting the other. Such loyalty is touching, don't you think?" The silence that followed was thick enough to touch. Lionel rose suddenly, muttering something about an appointment, but Graves was quicker. "Sit down, sir." His voice had lost all its politeness. Mrs. Lockwood gave a small, sharp laugh. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Lionel, it's over. She's got us." Lionel turned on her. "You were the one who panicked. I told you just to fix the label, but no, you had to cut the ribbon, and Fletcher caught you. And you," she shot back, "took the shears from me and—" "Enough," Graves said, his tone final. "We'll take this to the station." Miss Marple sat back, her hands folded, in her lap, as the inspector dealt with the formalities. The details would come out soon enough. How Mrs. Lockwood had been facing disqualification for altering her entry. How Lionel had been desperate to ensure she won so she'd support his greenhouse scheme. How Fletcher's unexpected arrival had thrown them into chaos. Mrs. Lockwood had cut the ribbon. Fletcher had protested. And Lionel, seizing the shears still in her hand, had struck the fatal blow. When they had gone, Graves lingered at the door. "How did you know they'd both done it?" Miss Marple smiled. "It was simple, Inspector. The ribbon was cut cleanly, without fraying. That takes a steady hand, and Mrs. Lockwood prides herself on her careful work. The blow that killed Fletcher, on the other hand, was clumsy and struck from an awkward angle, more likely from someone taller and less precise. And of course, there was their habit of meeting in quiet corners to coordinate their stories. All I needed was to give them a little nudge, and they did the rest." Graves shook his head in admiration. "You make it sound easy. Human nature is very simple, once you've seen enough of it," Miss Marple said, her voice mild. "People always imagine their secrets are unique. But in truth, they're much the same as the ones I've seen in many other places, just dressed in different clothes." As the inspector left, Miss Marple returned to her knitting. Outside, the village was settling back into its familiar rhythm, though it would be some time before the frosted greenhouse was spoken of without a certain shiver. She suspected the chrysanthemums would bloom more quietly next year. But life in St. Mildred's, like the seasons, would roll on. And as always, Miss Marple would be there, watching, listening, and waiting for the next small disturbance to ripple the surface of village life, knowing that beneath, the currents of human nature flowed on, unchanged. The day after Lionel Whitcomb and Mrs. Lockwood were taken away, St. Mildred's awoke with the peculiar hush that follows the resolution of a scandal. The air was cool and pale, the lane still damp from the night's drizzle. People moved about their business a little more quickly than usual, avoiding lingering at doorways or pausing too long to talk. The gossip, of course, had not ceased. Indeed, it would be some weeks before the greenhouse murder faded from the front of every conversation. But the tone had changed. It was now safely in the past, and therefore the property of storytellers, not problem solvers. Miss Marple, however, was not yet quite finished with the matter. There were loose threads, small but untidy, and she had the sort of mind that disliked leaving such things unresolved. The essentials had been proved well enough. Mrs. Lockwood had taken Fletcher's shears to cut the ribbon from her rival's entry, intending to make it look as though it had already been judged and passed over. Fletcher had caught her in the act, and Lionel, fearing the exposure would ruin his chances of persuading her to support his winter-forcing scheme, had struck Fletcher down. But the timing, the exact sequence of moments between the ribbon's disappearance and Fletcher's death, still itched at the edges of her mind. She set out that morning for the vicarage with a small basket of early apples, knowing the Reverend Chiswell was a man who liked to set things in order almost as much as she did. He greeted her warmly, ushering her into his study, where the fire burned cheerfully despite the mildness of the day. "I suppose," he said as he accepted the apples, "that we can be thankful the matter is resolved. Such a dreadful business. So out of keeping with the village." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled just slightly. Out of keeping in method, perhaps, but not in motive. Pride and self-interest are as native to St. Mildred's as they are to anywhere else. He gave a small sigh of agreement. "True enough. Still, I can't help feeling sorry for Mrs. Whitcomb. To have her own son involved, what a trial." "Yes," Miss Marple said gently. "I think she suspected something early on, though she might not have known exactly what. It explains her careful reserve." The Reverend leaned forward. "There is one thing I still don't understand. Why didn't they simply run away after the deed was done? Why hang about the greenhouse for the rest of the judging?" Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "Because leaving at once would have drawn attention. Lionel especially could not afford to be seen hurrying away. His movements were already being noted by more than one pair of eyes. And Mrs. Lockwood, well, she had her ribbon to restore. She couldn't risk it being found in the shed where Fletcher fell. Better to put it back in place as if nothing had happened." They talked a little longer, and when Miss Marple left, she felt she had settled at least one of her own lingering questions. The rest, she thought, would be settled with a visit to Mrs. Whitcomb. The widow received her in the morning room as before, looking older than she had a week ago. There was no preamble. Miss Marple offered her condolences and then said quietly, "You must not think too hardly of your son. It was a dreadful thing, but done in a moment of foolishness, not malice." Mrs. Whitcomb's eyes filled briefly before she looked away. "I suppose you are right. I can't pretend to approve. What mother could? But I know Lionel thought he was protecting me. He believed a scandal at the exhibition would reflect on the estate and on me. That is just the sort of reasoning," Miss Marple said softly, "that leads to great harm from small beginnings. One tells oneself it is for the good, and before one knows it." She let the thought trail away. There was a silence between them, not uncomfortable, but tinged with the weight of things better left unsaid. When Miss Marple rose to go, Mrs. Whitcomb took her hand and said simply, "Thank you." On her way home, she passed the frosted greenhouse. The constable was no longer on guard. The door hung open to the air, and the chrysanthemums within looked faintly forlorn now that the competition was over. She stepped inside, her footsteps muffled on the damp boards. The place smelled of earth and fading blooms. She went to the bench where the missing ribbon had been found restored and touched the stem of the plant beside it. The cut ends of the ribbon's original tie were still faintly visible beneath the new knot, as neat as any professional gardener's work. She was still standing there when Mrs. Partridge came bustling in, a basket on her arm. "Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't expect to see anyone here. I was just fetching a few of the leftover blooms for the church." They chatted briefly, and Mrs. Partridge, never one to resist a fresh audience, recounted for the third or fourth time how she had been among the first to hear the cry from the back of the greenhouse on the morning of the murder. "It was before all the trouble, mind you," she said. "I thought it was just someone startled by a mouse or some such." Miss Marple smiled faintly, and perhaps it was. Though I fancy it was the moment Mrs. Lockwood realized the ribbon she meant to cut was rather more securely fastened than she expected. That would account for the shears being fetched from the shed. Mrs. Partridge blinked. "Well, I never thought of that." They parted soon after, and Miss Marple walked home through the quiet lanes. She felt the case had reached its natural end. The inspector would tidy up the formalities. The court would have its say in due course. The village would absorb the shock and return to its usual preoccupations. The only remaining question, in her mind, was whether Mrs. Lockwood's or Lionel's original aim had ever truly been about flowers, or whether the blooms had merely been the stage upon which a different play had been acted. The following Sunday at church, the air was heavy with the scent of chrysanthemums arranged at the altar. The congregation sang with particular energy, as if to affirm the return of order. Miss Marple, seated in her customary pew, listened with quiet satisfaction. Human nature, she reflected, was endlessly inventive in finding ways to cloak selfishness in the guise of duty or affection. The greenhouse affair had been no different from the quarrels and jealousies she had seen in far humbler settings. Only the tools and the backdrop had changed. After the service, she lingered in the churchyard to speak with friends and neighbors. The talk was already turning to the coming winter, to preserving fruit and preparing gardens for the frost. Soon enough, the murder would be another story folded into the history of Saint. Mildred's, told and retold with small embellishments until fact and invention grew indistinguishable. And that, Miss Marple thought, was as it should be. Justice had been done, insofar as it ever could be in such matters. The truth had been uncovered, not by force, but by a gentle peeling away of pretense, like dead leaves from a healthy plant. That evening, she sat by her fire with her knitting and allowed her thoughts to drift. Outside, the wind moved through the hedges, carrying the faint scent of damp earth. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Then all was quiet again. The village slept, secure in the belief that its peace had been restored. Miss Marple, who knew better than most how fragile such peace could be, was content to let them believe it. There would be other disturbances, other little tempests in the teacup of village life. And when they came, she would be ready. As always, watching and listening, a quiet presence in the corner, waiting for the moment when the smallest detail would show itself to be the key to everything. The week that followed settled into a strange kind of calm, the sort of lull that comes after a storm has passed, but before the garden has quite recovered from its battering. St. Mildred's looked much as it always did. Children walking to school with satchels swinging, the butcher's cart making its rounds, Mrs. Cutter bustling to and from the tea shop. But the greenhouse murder had left a faint bruise on the village's easy manners. Conversations were a touch quieter, laughter not quite so quick to rise. It was as if everyone had been reminded that, even in their neat, hedged world, malice could bloom as surely as roses. Miss Marple noticed it most in the pauses. A brief silence before Mrs. Partridge mentioned the Whitcombs, a glance exchanged over Mrs. Lockwood's empty seat at the Horticultural Society. Even the vicar's sermons seemed to have taken on a slightly sterner edge, though he would have been the last to admit it. On a soft Thursday afternoon, Miss Marple took her customary walk along the lane that led toward the old mill. She passed the Whitcomb estate, where the greenhouse stood quiet now, its frosted panes catching what little sunlight the season still offered. A lone gardener moved among the beds, cutting back the last of the chrysanthemums for winter. The sight stirred in her a curious feeling. Not triumph, exactly, but the same tidy satisfaction she felt when a garden bed had been weeded and mulched, ready for its next season. She paused at the gate, watching the man work. The blooms were still beautiful, but in their last days, their edges showed faint browning, their stems bending under their own weight. She thought of the exhibition and of how pride in perfection had brought about such ruin. In her experience, it was rarely great wealth or grand ambitions that drove people to murder, but the fierce desire to protect some small thing that they valued above all else. A reputation, a cherished plan, a place in the eyes of their neighbors. That evening, the vicarage hosted a modest supper for a few parishioners, and Miss Marple attended partly for the company, partly to observe. Such gatherings, she knew, were as instructive as any police interrogation. People, when they felt safe again, often let slip more than they intended. Mrs. Partridge was in fine form, telling the story of the greenhouse affair, as though she had been at the very center of it. "Of course," she said, "I knew something was amiss the moment I heard that cry from the back. You can always tell when trouble's brewing, especially in a place as orderly as that." The others murmured in agreement, and Miss Marple allowed herself a faint smile. Memory, she reflected, was like a climbing rose. It tended to wander and spread, finding supports where it could. In time, half the village would remember being in the greenhouse that morning, and each version would be a little different from the last. Later, as she walked home under a sky streaked with pale moonlight, she considered the arc of events from start to finish. What struck her most was how quickly one small deceit, a cut ribbon, a switched label, had spiraled into violence. The ribbon itself had no real value, yet it had been the catalyst for everything. She supposed that was why she so often looked for the tiny, seemingly unimportant detail. In her experience, it was there that the roots of a crime were usually found. The next morning brought a letter from Inspector Graves, written in his blunt, workmanlike hand. He thanked her for her assistance and reported that Lionel Whitcomb had made a full confession, confirming her reconstruction of events. Mrs. Lockwood, too, had admitted her part, though she insisted she had never intended more than to alter the judging in her favor. Both would stand trial in the coming weeks. Graves ended by remarking, rather more warmly than his usual style, that her particular way of looking at things had been the deciding factor in breaking their combined silence. Miss Marple set the letter aside with a small nod. It was pleasant to be appreciated, though she had never sought praise. She preferred the quiet knowledge that she had restored the balance, set things in their proper place. The law would deal with the rest. That afternoon she visited the church, where Mrs. Cutter and a few other ladies were arranging flowers for the Sunday service. Among the blooms were several chrysanthemums from the exhibition, still fresh enough to serve. Miss Marple helped place them in tall brass vases, her hands deft despite the stiffness of age. "They're such showy flowers," Mrs. Cutter remarked, stepping back to admire the arrangement. "Beautiful, but they do take a deal of looking after." "Like some people," Miss Marple said mildly, and the other women laughed, taking it for a harmless jest. By the time she left the church, the autumn light had begun to fade. The village lay before her in its usual stillness. The shop fronts closed for the day, the faint scent of coal smoke drifting from chimneys. It struck her that peace in a place like St. Mildred's was not the absence of trouble, but the quiet ability to fold trouble into the fabric of life, to let it become another pattern in the weave. She reached her cottage and set the kettle on the hob. As she waited for it to boil, she looked out over her small back garden. The last of her own chrysanthemums nodded in the breeze, their petals beginning to curl. She thought of Arnold Fletcher, not an easy man, but an honest one, and hoped he would have approved of the care taken with his beloved greenhouse in the end. When the tea was ready, she settled into her chair by the fire, her knitting basket at her side. The room was warm, the lamplight steady. Outside, the wind was picking up, rattling the bare branches. She could hear the faint hum of voices from the lane, neighbors exchanging the last news of the day, before closing their doors for the night. Miss Marple knew there would be other cases, other small disturbances that rippled through the quiet surface of village life. There always were. And she knew, too, that she would meet them in the same way she met this one. Not with drama or bluster, but with patience, observation, and the sure knowledge that human nature, for all its disguises, rarely changed. She picked up her needles and began to knit, the rhythm steady and comforting. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the hour. The fire crackled softly. The village slept, or soon would, believing itself safe again. And perhaps, for now, it was. A week later, the sharp winds of late autumn swept through St. Mildred's, rattling the last leaves from the trees and carrying the smell of damp earth through the lanes. The greenhouse murder had settled into the lower murmur of village life, no longer the urgent subject of every conversation, but still present, like the echo of a bell that refused to die entirely away. Miss Marple, for her part, had returned to her ordinary routine. Letters answered in the morning, a walk to the post, a bit of weeding in her small garden between showers. But she noticed the lingering shifts in behavior, the way Mrs. Partridge's eyes flicked toward the Whitcomb estate whenever the family name came up, the way Mr. Moffat kept his remarks to the bare minimum when the Horticultural Society met. Mrs. Lockwood's absence at those meetings left a gap as visible as an unwatered plant. It was during one such meeting at the parish hall that Miss Marple found herself quietly at the center of an unexpected little drama. The Society's committee was discussing the allocation of funds for next year's exhibition, and there was talk of whether to continue using the frosted greenhouse at all. Some felt it was now tainted by association. Others argued that abandoning it would be an insult to the late Colonel Whitcomb's memory. "I think," Miss Marple said mildly, "that the building itself is innocent of wrongdoing. We must be careful not to condemn a place for the acts of those who used it unwisely. After all, a garden can be restored with time and care, even if it's been badly tended." Her comment, couched in the safe terms of horticulture, seemed to ease the room. People nodded, and the discussion moved on to safer matters, such as the order for new flower pots. But she had seen the relief in Mrs. Whitcomb's face. The woman had sat silent until then, and now allowed herself the smallest breath of ease. The meeting concluded early, and Miss Marple left with her scarf pulled tight against the wind. As she passed the green, she was stopped by young Tom Redding, who came striding up from the smithy with a curious mixture of determination and hesitation. "Miss Marple," he said, almost abruptly, "I wanted to thank you." "For what, my dear?" "For not letting them think it was me. I know some people said it was. Maybe I didn't help matters, keeping to myself. But I didn't do it, and you knew it." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I didn't know it, Tom. Not at first. But I knew you hadn't the look of someone carrying a deed like that about with him. A little pride, perhaps, a little resentment, yes. But not murder." He looked at her for a long moment, then gave a small nod and went on his way. Miss Marple stood watching him go, the corners of her mouth softening. In her view, the saving of an innocent from suspicion was just as important as the catching of the guilty. That evening, the wind rose to a low, constant moan around her cottage. She sat by the fire with her knitting and the day's post, which included a note from Inspector Graves. It was brief, but it told her that Lionel Whitcomb and Mrs. Lockwood had both been remanded for trial, the former facing the more serious charge, the latter a likely sentence for conspiracy and obstruction. The inspector added, almost as an afterthought, "I sometimes wonder, Miss Marple, how you manage to see what others miss. If it is observation, it is of a sort they don't teach in the police." Miss Marple smiled at that, laying the letter aside. It was not only observation, of course. It was the recognition of patterns, the way human nature repeated itself in endless variations. A quarrel over a flower show ribbon was no different, in its essence, from the jealousies and resentments she had seen in villages since girlhood. People simply dressed their motives in whatever clothes their world provided. The following Sunday after service, she walked out to the cemetery. Fletcher's grave had been freshly dug, a modest wooden cross marking the spot until the stone could be set. There were flowers, white chrysanthemums, of course, left by someone who had taken care to arrange them neatly. She stood for a few minutes, her gloved hands resting lightly on her umbrella, and thought of the man as she had last seen him, sprawled on the potting shed floor, his life ended over so small and foolish a matter. "Poor man," she murmured. "If only you had kept your tongue for another day." The sky had grown overcast by the time she returned to the village, but she did not go straight home. Instead, she stopped at Mrs. Cutter's for a small loaf and a bit of conversation. Predictably, the talk turned to the exhibition and how it would be managed next year. "They say," Mrs. Cutter confided, "that Mrs. Whitcomb may step back from the society altogether. Too much strain, poor thing. And she's not been in the best health. Of course, there's already talk of who might take over her duties." Miss Marple only smiled. Villages, she thought, were like gardens in more ways than one. Remove one plant, and others would lean toward the gap, seeking the light. When she finally reached her cottage, the lamps were already lit against the gray afternoon. She made her tea and sat by the window, watching as the clouds scudded low over the hedgerows. Somewhere beyond them, the first frost of the season was waiting. The thought of it made her glance toward her own chrysanthemums, still clinging to their last days of bloom. She would cut them before nightfall, arrange them in vases, and let their color keep the coming cold at bay for a little while longer. As she sipped her tea, she reflected that the village would, in time, forget the sharper edges of the greenhouse affair. It would become a story told to newcomers, embellished with each retelling, until the truth was half legend. But she would remember the small things, the uneven bicycle tire, the neatness of a cut ribbon, the shift in a voice when fear began to set in. Those details, like tiny seeds, had grown into the solution. And perhaps that was why she felt no need to keep trophies or souvenirs from the cases she had been involved in. The memory of how a thing had unfolded, of the human hearts that had driven it, was enough. Outside, the wind rattled the bare branches, and the light in the west faded to a dim wash of silver. Miss Marple rose to fetch her scissors for the chrysanthemums. Tomorrow would be colder, and the blooms would not last much longer. Better to bring them in now, where they could be enjoyed in warmth and safety. It struck her, as she cut the first stem, that life in a village was much the same. You tended it as best you could, removed what was dangerous or diseased, and hoped that what remained would flourish. You could not prevent every blight, but you could keep watch, ready to act when the first signs appeared. And that, Miss Marple thought with quiet satisfaction, was work enough for any one person, especially a person who, to the casual eye, was doing nothing more remarkable than minding her own garden. Winter came early to St. Mildred's that year. By the first week of December, frost lay thick along the hedgerows in the morning, and the pond by the green wore a thin, glassy skin. Smoke curled steadily from cottage chimneys, and the village settled into its slower, colder rhythm. Shop doors kept shut against the chill. Errands done quickly, evenings spent close to the fire. The frosted greenhouse stood empty now, its frosted panes dull under the low winter sun. The chrysanthemums had long since been cleared away, the benches swept bare. Only the faint scent of earth lingered inside, mixed with a sharper tang of cold air. The building would not open again until spring, when new seedlings would take the place of the blooms that had once been at the heart of so much trouble. Miss Marple had passed it more than once on her walks, always pausing for a moment, not to dwell on the murder, but to note how quickly nature, and indeed the village, absorbed such disturbances. People no longer lowered their voices quite so much when the subject was mentioned. Mrs. Whitcomb, though she had resigned from the Horticultural Society, still attended church each Sunday, and most had decided it was kinder not to speak of Lionel in her hearing. Mrs. Lockwood's cottage had been let to a couple from the next parish, and Mr. Moffat had resumed his old, brisk manner, though with a trace more civility toward his rivals. On one bright, cold afternoon, Miss Marple was trimming the last of the dead stalks from her winter beds when Mrs. Partridge appeared at the gate, cheeks red from the wind. She came bearing a small package of shortbread, for company, and news that the society had decided to hold the next exhibition in the parish hall rather than the greenhouse. Just for a year, mind you, give the place a rest. "I think that is wise," Miss Marple said, wiping her hands on her gardening apron. "Sometimes a little distance helps." Mrs. Partridge agreed. Then, lowering her voice, in the way that meant she was about to share something she had already told to 3 other people, added, "Of course, it's not the same without Fletcher. Quarrelsome as he was, he kept everyone honest." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes, my dear, that he did." When Mrs. Partridge had gone, Miss Marple returned to her trimming. It was a quiet pleasure, tidying the garden for the winter, cutting back what would not survive, tucking bulbs into the soil for spring, ensuring everything was in its proper place. It struck her that solving a crime was much the same. One dealt with what was harmful, preserved what was worth keeping, and left the rest to time. A few days later, Inspector Graves called unexpectedly. He was in the village on other business, but said he could not pass without stopping in. Over tea, they spoke briefly of the trial to come in the new year. "I'll admit," Graves said, setting down his cup, "it's still a bit unusual for us to see 2 people working together in that way. one starting the trouble, the other making it worse. "It's more common than you think," Miss Marple said mildly. "Human nature being what it is, mischief often grows in pairs. One person has the impulse, another has the means, and together they do something neither would have dared alone." Graves regarded her with the expression of a man who had learned not to underestimate her. "Well, in any case, I'm grateful you were watching. I don't think we'd have got the truth out of them otherwise." When he had gone, the house was quiet again. The only sound the ticking of the clock and the occasional pop from the fire. Miss Marple took up her knitting, but after a few rows, her eyes wandered to the window. Outside, the garden was bare now, save for the neat rows of bulbs beneath the soil. She thought of how quickly the color and bustle of the exhibition had turned to suspicion and fear, and how quickly that, too, had passed. On Christmas Eve, she attended the midnight service at the church. The pews were full, the air scented with evergreen boughs and candle wax. As the final hymn swelled, she glanced around at the familiar faces, some animated with joy, others more subdued, but all gathered together, as villages had done for generations. After the service, she walked home through the frosty air. The lane was silver under the moon, her breath making little clouds in the cold. In the stillness, the events of the past months seemed distant, like a story she had read long ago. Yet she knew the truth of it would remain with her, not for the drama of the murder, but for the small, human details that had given it shape. The neatness of a cut ribbon, the worn tread of a bicycle tire, the flicker of fear in a voice. Reaching her gate, she paused for a moment, looking out over the sleeping village. Somewhere, a clock chimed the hour. The sound seemed to fold itself into the quiet, as if the village itself were marking the passing of this chapter and preparing for the next. Inside, she lit the lamp and poured herself a cup of tea, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. She thought again of the greenhouse, waiting in the cold for spring. Life would return to it, as it always did, and she would be here to see it, watching, listening, quietly tending to her own small corner of the world, ready for whatever seeds might be sown, for good or ill. In her experience, the best one could hope for was to keep the garden of one's life as free from weeds as possible, and to know when to pluck out what threatened to overgrow. It was patient work, but she had never minded patience. Miss Marple set down her cup, picked up her knitting, and let the steady rhythm of the needles carry her thoughts forward into the peaceful dark. Snow came to St. Mildred's in the second week of January, softening every roof and hedge under a white quilt. The village seemed to move more slowly in the hush it brought. Footsteps muffled, voices lowered, as if the world itself had taken to whispering. In the post that morning, Miss Marple received a letter from Inspector Graves. It was brief, written in his usual blunt style. Verdict in. Lionel Whitcomb, guilty of manslaughter. Mrs. Lockwood, guilty of conspiracy to pervert justice. Both sentenced accordingly. Prosecution's case was strengthened by your evidence on the shears and the ribbon. You were quite right about the sequence of events. Jury accepted it without hesitation. Miss Marple read the letter twice, not because there was anything new in it, but because it closed the last gap in the chain of events she had assembled in her mind. The pieces had fitted together with quiet inevitability. Mrs. Lockwood had been the first to set the crime in motion, slipping into the potting shed with Fletcher's shears in hand, intent on cutting the prize ribbon from a rival bloom and retying it to her own. Fletcher's sudden entrance had brought a sharp exchange, sharp enough to carry into the greenhouse where Miss Marple, without quite knowing why, had taken note of it. Lionel had arrived moments later, found them mid-quarrel, and seized the shears in a clumsy attempt to silence Fletcher for good. The blow had been as unplanned as it was fatal. The ribbon had been restored before the judging resumed, neat enough to fool most eyes, but not Miss Marple's. She had seen the fresh cut beneath the new knot, had noticed the small but telling smudge of ink on Mrs. Lockwood's finger from relabeling her entry. And she had thought, too, of the uneven bicycle tire tread by the estate gate, a detail small enough to escape notice, but not from someone who had spent a lifetime watching small details. Over tea that afternoon with Mrs. Partridge, who had, of course, already heard the verdict, Miss Marple spoke of it in her mild, unassuming way. It was all very sad, she said, and quite unnecessary. Had either of them paused for a moment to think, they might have found a dozen ways out of it without resorting to violence. But people seldom think when they feel cornered. They lash out, and then spend all their cleverness trying to undo what cannot be undone. Mrs. Partridge shook her head. And over a ribbon. I suppose it must be worth something to them, but I can't see how. It isn't the ribbon, Miss Marple said. It's what the ribbon stands for. Pride, reputation, the need to be thought of as a winner. Those are dangerous things, in their way. Just as dangerous as jealousy or greed. I've seen them lead to worse than this. The winter sun slanted low through the window, catching the frost outside in a brief glitter before it faded. The village would remember the greenhouse affair for years to come, though the tale would grow softer with the retelling, the sharp edges worn down until it was little more than a cautionary anecdote for newcomers. When Mrs. Partridge had gone, Miss Marple tidied away the tea things and took her place by the fire. She thought, not for the first time, how human nature was much the same in St. Mildred's as anywhere else. Ambitions, fears, vanities all, wrapped in whatever genteel trappings the setting allowed. In London they might quarrel over money or politics. Here it was chrysanthemums and ribbons. But the roots were the same, and so were the ways they showed themselves, if one only knew where to look. Outside, the snow had begun again, drifting in slow, steady flakes. The frosted greenhouse, standing quiet in the whiteness, would bloom again in spring. And Miss Marple, with her knitting in her lap and her eyes on the world beyond her window, would be ready when the next small disturbance began to stir beneath the surface of village life.